Our story kicks off way back in the days of colonial America, down in a sleepy little riverside town called Willow Creek, nestlet in the heart of Virginia. Meet our main guy, James "Jimmy" Henderson. Picture this, a young fella living along the muddy banks of the James River, scraping by with his hard-working mom. Life ain't easy for Jimmy. When he was just 7 years old, tragedy struck. His dad died in a freak accident while hauling goods on a rickety old wagon. They buried him somewhere out in the woods, though nobody's quite sure where his bones ended up. After Pa passed, Jimmy's mom, Martha Henderson, toughed it out alone, raising her boy through sweat and grit, determined to see him grow into a decent man. By the time Jimmy hit 14, he was already stepping up big time, working as a ferryman, rowing folks across the river day in and day out. It's backbreaking work, let me tell you. Rain or shine, he's out there from dawn till dusk, hauling that or through the water. Most of his passengers are local townsfolk, so they're good for a friendly nod, but not much else. The pay? Barely enough to keep cornbread and beans on the table. Growing up dirt poor. Jimmy's oozed to the grind. The kind of life where pennies are fight. Still, he's got dreams. Big ones. He imagines a day when he won't have to worry about where his next meal's coming from, when he can hang up that oar and live a little easier. One crisp fall day in Willow Creek, things took a turn for the worse. Jimmy's mom, Martha, came down with a nasty fever, coughing and shivering something fierce. The local doc said she needed medicine from Richmond, the nearest big town, and fast. So Jimmy, being the good son he is, hitched up his rowboat early that morning, planning to paddle downriver and catch the main road to the city. He figured he'd ferry a few folks along the way to scrape together enough coin for the trip. With the leaves turning gold and red, he set off, his mind racing about how to help his ma. As he trudged along a fork in the dirt road just past the ferry landing, something caught his eye, a lumpy burlap sack half hidden in the tall grass. Jimmy slowed down, glancing around. Not a soul in sicht. Just the wind rustling trug the penis. Curiosity got the better of him, so he stepped off the path, bent down, and hefted the sack up. Lord Almighty, it was heavy. He untied the knot, peeked inside, and nearly dropped it, 10 shiny gold bars, glinting like buried treasure. Jimmy's heart started pounding. He'd never seen that much wealth in his whole life. Half excited, half terrified, he dragged the sack behind a big oak tree and crouched down, staring at those bars like they might bite him. His mind went wild. What do I do with this? He muttered to himself. 10 gold bars. Had to be worth a fortune. Probably dropped by some merchant hurrying through on the Richmond Road. Should he sit tight and wait for the owner to come back? Or sneak it home quiet-like? With that kind of money, he could hire the best doctor in Virginia for Ma, maybe even save her life. Heck, he could fix up their leaky old cabin, patch the roof, and stop the rain from dripping on their heads every storm. And why stop there? He could buy a proper suit, court a nice gal, and settle down. Money like that could turn his whole world around. Jimmy licked his lips, practically tasting the good life. But then that little voice in his head piped up. This ain't yours, Jimmy Henderson, it whispered. You take it. You'll be looking over your shoulder forever, wondering if Someone's coming for you. He wrestled with it hard, greed tugging one way, conscience pulling the other. After what felt like forever, sitting there with the cold dirt under him and the gold in his hands, Jimmy made up his mind. Right beats wrong, he figured. So he hauled the sack back to where he found it, plopped down beside it, and waited, keeping an eye on the road for whoever might come claiming it. About an hour later, he heard the clatter of hooves thundering down the path. A fancy carriage rolled up, dust kicking everywhere, and stopped right near the fork. Jimmy perked up, peering out from behind the tree. 2 fellas hopped out, an older guy, plump and flustered, and a wiry driver. From their chatter, Jimmy pieced it together. The gold was theirs, all right. They'd lost it on the road, and now they were tearing their hair out looking for it. Jimmy watched from behind that big oak as the 2 men scrambled around near the carriage, arguing and pointing every which way. The older fella, red-faced and sweaty despite the cool fall air, was barking orders at the driver. Jimmy caught snippets of their talk, something about a debt collection gone sideways and a sack they couldn't afford to lose. That's when he knew for sure, this was their gold. With a deep breath and a knot in his stomach, he grabbed the burlap sack, stepped out from his hiding spot, and shuffled toward them, the weight of the bars dragging at his arms. Excuse me, sirs, Jimmy called out, his voice cracking a little. The 2 spun around, startled. The plump man squinted at him, then at the sack, and his eyes went wide as saucers. That's mine," he stammered, rushing over. Jimmy held it out, forcing a shaky smile. "Found it back there in the grass." "Figurt so mir und kam looking." The older man snatched the sack, peeked inside, and let out a whoop that echoed through the trees. "Boy, you've just saved my hide," he hollered, clapping Jimmy on the shoulder so hard he nearly stumbled. Up close, Jimmy got a good look at him, gray hair poking out from under a tricorn hat, a fancy waistcoat stretched tight over his belly.
Names Walter Grayson, the man said, still grinning like a kid at Christmas. I'm a trader out of Williamsburg.
Came up this way to settle a debt, but I got in a rush to head home. Driver here, he shot a glare at the wiry fella, stopped to check the road, and I stepped out to, relieve myself.
Must we set the sack down and forgot it in the panic to get moving?
Walter kept talking, half to Jimmy, half to himself. "This gold's my lifeline. Business would have gone under without it. You're a godsend, son." He started to kneel right there in the dirt, like he was about to bow or something, but Jimmy grabbed his arm, flustered.
"No, sir, Mr. Grayson, don't do that.
You're old enough to be my pa.
I can't let you kneel to me."
Walter chuckled, straightening up.
Fair enough, fair enough. What's your name, Keith?
"Where you from?" "Jimmy Henderson, sir," he replied, scratching the back of his neck.
"Life just up the river a ways.
Was headed to Richmond to get medicine for my ma, she's sick. Saw your sack on the way and figured I'd wait for the owner." "Well, Jimmy Henderson, you're a rare breed," Walter said, his tone softening. "Most folks would have run off with this and never looked back. Tell you what, hop in the carriage. We're not far from Willow Creek, and I'll drop you home. Want to meet this ma of yours, too?" Jimmy hesitated, but Walter was already waving him over, so he climbed aboard, the driver cracking the reins to get them rolling. Before long, they pulled up to Jimmy's rickety cabin by the river. Martha was still laid up in bed, pale and weak, when Walter strode in behind Jimmy. Seeing her state, the trader didn't waste a second. He pulled a gold bar from his sack and pressed it into Jimmy's hands. "Take this," he insisted. "Get her the best doctor you can find." Jimmy tried to protest, but Walter wouldn't hear it. "You saved me, boy. This is the least I can do." By then, dusk was settling in, and Walter, still lugging all that gold, decided it was too risky to travel at night. "Mind if I bunk here till morning?" he asked. Jimmy and Martha nodded, and the three of them ended up talking late into the night, Walter spinning tales of his trading days, Jimmy soaking it all in. Come sunrise, after a quick breakfast of grits and coffee, Walter and his driver hitched up to leave. But before he went, he slipped Jimmy another small pouch of coins. "For you and your ma," he said with a wink. "Take care of her, son." With that gold, things started looking up. Martha got her medicine, and slowly but surely, she pulled through. Jimmy couldn't believe it. His honest streak had paid off in ways he never imagined. After Walter Grayson left that morning, life in Willow Creek started to shift for Jimmy and Martha. With the gold he'd given them, they patched up the cabin, got Martha back on her feet, and even had a little left over. Jimmy kept at his ferry gig, but now he was dreaming bigger, maybe fixing up the boat, or even finding a wife to settle down with. Martha, feeling spry again, started nagging him about grandkids, so she'd been pestering the local matchmaker, Widow Jenkins, to find him a good gal. Jimmy wasn't in a rush, but he couldn't deny the idea sounded nice. Then, out of the blue, about a month later, Walter Grayson rolled back into town. His carriage rattled up to the Henderson cabin unannounced, kicking up dust and startling the chickens. Jimmy and Martha stepped outside, jaws dropping, hadn't expected to see him again so soon. Walter hopped down, all smiles, and after some small talk about the weather and Martha's health, he got to the point. "Jimmy, my boy," he said, leaning against the porch rail, "I've got a question for you."
"You hitched yet?" Jimmy blinked, kaukt auf guard.
No, sir.
Ain't got a wife.
Why?"
Walter grinned wieder.
Good. See, last time I was here, I didn't get to tell you everything. My family's done all right for itself. Trading business keeps us comfortable, you might say. But I've only got one kid, a daughter named Clara. She's about your age, give or take. Since you're still a bachelor, I'll lay it out plain. I'd like you to marry her, come join the family. What do you reckon? Jimmy froze,
his brain scrambling to catch up. Marry Clara Grayson? Move to Williamsburg? He managed to stammer, Mr. Grayson, I don't know what to say.
Juve sehen hovi life.
Ma's been sick half my life, and I ain't got much to my name but this fairy and a strong back. I'm not sure I'm cut out for your kind of folks. Walter waved a hand, brushing off the doubt.
Nonsense, son.
I don't care about fancy pedigrees.
Wat I see in you is honesty, rare essence tesedes, and a good heart.
That's worth more than gold to me.
Jure someone I can trust is my girl.
He paused, then added, now I'll be straight with you. Clara's had a rough go, lost her ma when she was little, and she's been sickly since she was a tot. Plus, well, she ain't exactly a looker. Not saying that to scare you off, just want you to know what you're signing up for. Up to you though. No pressure.
Jimmy's head spoon.
A sickly, plain girl? He wasn't sure how to feel about that. But then Walter sweetened the pot. She's my only kid, Jimmy.
You marry here, awaiting Ivy Build. The business, the house, all of it, ends up your somede. Looks fade, money don't. Think it over.
Jimmy nodded slowly, still reeling. I gotta talk to Ma about this, sir. It's a big step. Inside, Martha had overheard every word from the back room. When Jimmy came in, she pounced.
Well boy, what you gonna do?
That man's offering you a golden ticket. Jimmy rubbed his neck, pacing. I know, Ma.
If he say yes, we reset for life. No more scrapping by.
His business be mine down the road. But what? She pressed. She's sickly, Ma. And ugly, he says. I don't know if I can do it. Martha stared at him, hands on hips. Jimmy Henderson, this ain't just about you, it's about us. You've seen how hard we've had it. I'm tired of this life, and you ought to be too.
Hey Scott von Daukhater, everything's your somede. You really gonna turn that down over a girl's face.
I ain't saying no yet, Jimmy shot back, firm as iron. Just need to think. It's my whole life we're talking about.
I don't wanna ruin it chasing $1.
Martha sighed, seeing the steel in his eyes, and let it drop. After a bit more back and forth, Jimmy stepped back out to the porch where Walter waited. Mr. Grayson, he said, squaring his shoulders, I'm in. I'll do it.
Walter's face lit up, tension melting away. Hot damn, son, you we made my day.
Now listen, I raised Clara myself after her ma passed.
She's my heart and soul.
You marry her, you gotta treat her right.
I don't care if I'm 6 feet under. If you hurt here, I'll haunt you till kingdom come.
We clear? Jimmy nodded quick. Clear as day, sir. I ain't book smart, but I know right from wrong. I'll do right by her, I swear it. With that, Walter clapped him on the back, satisfied. They set the wedding for a month out, giving Jimmy time to wrap things up in Willow Creek. He sold off the old ferry, packed up the cabin, and got ready to haul Martha to Williamsburg. But deep down, he couldn't shake a nagging worry. Walter'd called Clara plain. What did that even mean? How bad could she be? He steeled himself for the worst, figuring the payoff was worth it. Little did he know what he was walking into. With the deal struck, Jimmy didn't waste time. Over the next month, he and Martha tied up loose ends in Willow Creek. He sold the beat-up ferry to a neighbor for a few bucks, packed their meager belongings into a couple of trunks, and hitched a ride with Walter's carriage to Williamsburg. It was a bumpy trip, but when they rolled into town, Jimmy's jaw hit the floor. The Grayson place wasn't just a house, it was a sprawling 2-story estate, all brick and shutters, with a stable out back and a garden that'd make a king jealous. Compared to their leaky shack, it was like stepping into a dream. Martha settled into a spare room, grinning ear to ear at the feather bed and real glass windows. Jimmy, though, couldn't relax. His stomach churned as the wedding day loomed. Walter had been blunt about Clara, sickly and plain, so Jimmy braced himself for the worst. Maybe she'd have a wart-covered face or a limp like old man Tucker back home. Still, he kept his chin up. A deal's a deal, and that Grayson fortune was worth it.
The big day came fast.
October 10, 1752, a crisp Saturday with the leaves blazing orange. The ceremony was simple, held in the Grayson parlor with a handful of Walter's trader pals and a preacher from town. Jimmy stood there in a borrowed suit, stiff as a board, waiting for Clara to come down the stairs. When she did, he nearly choked. Plain? Sure, if plain meant downright homely. Clara Grayson was a sight, round as a barrel, with a face like a soggy biscuit, all puffy cheeks and a double chin. Her dress, a lumpy green thing, didn't help, and she shuffled in with a wheeze, like every step was a chore.
Jimmys heart sank.
This was his wife? For a split second, he wavered. Could he really spend his life with her? But then he caught Walter's eye, saw the man's hopeful grin, and thought of the gold, the house, the future. He gritted his teeth and pushed through. Walter must have sensed the hesitation, 'cause he pulled Jimmy aside right after the vows. "You've seen her now," he whispered. "If you're having second thoughts, say it. I won't hold it against you, you've already done me a solid finding that gold. But if you're in for good." Jimmy swallowed hard. "No, sir.
I ain't a quitter.
I said I'd do it, and I will." Walter nodded, relieved.
"That's my boy. She's yours now. Treat her right."
And so, Jimmy Henderson and Clara Grayson tied the knot. She wasn't much to look at, no denying that, but as the days turned to weeks, Jimmy noticed something else.
Clara was sweet. Real sweet.
She didn't strut around like some rich girl, lording her family's money over him. Instead, she'd ask about his fairy days, listen with those watery blue eyes, and even laugh at his dumb jokes. She'd hobble around the house, frail as a sparrow, but still manage to fuss over Martha like she was her own ma, bringing her tea and quilts. Jimmy had to admit, she wasn't half bad company. Walter took Jimmy under his wing too. After the wedding, he started teaching him the trading game, how to haggle with merchants, tally ledgers, and spot a good deal. Jimmy picked it up quick, and before long, he was running errands to the docks, handling shipments of tobacco and molasses. It was a far cry from rowing that creaky ferry, and he liked it. Life was good, better than he'd ever dared hope. Then, about a year later, Walter took sick. A bad cough turned into something worse, and no doctor in Williamsburg could fix it. 2 weeks in, he was gone, laid out in the parlor where Jimmy'd said his vows. Before he passed, Walter grabbed Jimmy's hand, voice raspy. "Promise me you'll look after Clara," he croaked.
"She's all Ivy got."
"I swear it, sir," Jimmy said, choking up. Walter gave a weak nod, then slipped away. With Walter gone, Jimmy stepped up as head of the Grayson household. Overnight, he went from a river rat to a man of means, owning the estate, the business, the whole kit and caboodle. It was a wild turn, and for a while, he and Martha couldn't believe their luck. But as the shine wore off, Jimmy's eyes started wandering, and that's when the trouble began. After Walter's death, Jimmy settled into his new role as master of the Grayson estate, but it didn't take long for the shine to wear off. At first, he'd been grateful, Clara's kindness, the big house, the steady income from the trading business. But as months turned to years, something gnawed at him. Maybe it was the way Clara wheezed through the halls, or how her lumpy figure filled out every dress like a sack of potatoes. 2 years in, and no kids, not even a hint of one. Martha started grumbling about it too, her dreams of grandkids fading fast. Jimmy tried to brush it off, but the whispers in his head got louder. "This ain't the life I pictured." One evening, Martha cornered him by the fireplace. "Jimmy, what's going on with you and Clara? 2 years married, and her belly's still flat as a board. You telling me there's no hope for a little one?" Jimmy sighed, poking at the logs. "Ma, you think I don't want a kid? I do. But it ain't happening. I don't know if it's her or me, but it's driving me crazy." Martha narrowed her eyes. "Be honest, boy. You don't much like her, do you? Facing that homely mug every day, can't say I blame you. Even I get tired of looking at her."
"Ma, Ash."
Jimmy snapped, though her words hit home. "She's been good to us. We wouldn't be here without her pa." "Good don't mean grandkids," Martha shot back. "You ought to talk to her, take a second wife, maybe. A pretty little thing to give me a grandson." Jimmy shook his head. Walter'd roll in his grave. "He made me promise to treat her right, and he's barely cold in the ground. I can't do it, not yet." Martha huffed but let it slide. Trouble was, her nagging stuck with him, like a splinter he couldn't dig out. From then on, Clara started grating on him more, her slow shuffle, her raspy voice. He found himself staying out late, dodging home, nursing a pint at the tavern instead. One day, After sealing a deal for a shipment of cider, Jimmy wandered Williamsburg's bustling streets, letting the noise drown his thoughts. He ended up at a market stall near the docks, where an old fellow with a scruffy beard and a patched coat sat under a sign, "Fortunes told, 2 pence." Jimmy smirked, sounded like hogwash, but Martha's words still echoed, and he was desperate for answers. He tossed the coins down and sat. "All right, mister. Tell me if I've got kids in my future." The fortune teller squinted at him, scratching his chin. "Name's Amos." "Let's see." He studied Jimmy's face like it was a map, then nodded slow. "Yup, I see it clear as day. 2 sons, 6 grandkids. You'll have a full house, no doubt." Jimmy snorted. "You're full of it, old man. Been married 2 years, nothing. How's that gonna happen?" Amos didn't flinch. "I've been at this 30 years, son, and I don't miss. What's your wife's name?" "Clara," Jimmy muttered. "Clara Grayson?" Amos asked, tilting his head. Jimmy nodded, and the old man smirked. "Well, there's your snag. Kids'll come, but not with her. Your Real match ain't far off, tonight, even." "Tonight?" Jimmy leaned in, hooked despite himself. "What are you saying?" "Head down Main Street round 10, Amos said, tapping the table. "Keep walking straight. She's waiting, your future wife. Trust me." Jimmy laughed, half convinced it was a scam. "You better not be yanking my chain." Amos grinned, showing crooked teeth. "Tell you what, no charge today. I'll be here tomorrow. If I'm right, you come back and pay me double. If I'm wrong, smash my stall to bits. Deal." That sealed it. Jimmy couldn't argue with a bet like that. He left with a buzz in his chest, part excitement, part doubt. Come nightfall, he couldn't resist. At 10 sharp, he slipped out, telling Clara he had business to check. Main Street was quiet, just the flicker of lanterns and the creak of shop signs swaying in the breeze. He walked for an hour, muttering about Amos being a fraud, when a sound stopped him cold, soft sobbing under a big sycamore tree. Peering through the moonlight, he saw her, a young woman, maybe 20, hunched over, fumbling with a rope like she meant to hang it from a branch. "Whoa, hold up!" Jimmy shouted, sprinting over. He grabbed her arm just as she looped the rope, pulling her back. She gasped wide-eyed, a pretty thing, with dark hair and a face that had turned heads even tear-streaked. "What's wrong, miss?" he asked, softening his tone. Her name was Abigail, or Abby, she said, voice trembling. She'd come from Maryland, chasing kin who'd moved south, only to find them gone. Penniless and starving, she'd hit rock bottom. "Didn't see no other way," she whispered, staring at the ground. Jimmy's heart twisted. "Come on now, you don't need to do that. Let me help." After some coaxing, he convinced her to follow him, not home though. He couldn't parade her past Clara, not with Walter's ghost hanging over him. Instead, he took her to a little shack he'd quietly bought near the docks for storing goods. He set her up there, promising to check in. As he left, he couldn't shake her face. Abby was trouble, the kind he didn't need but couldn't walk away from. Jimmy couldn't get Abby out of his head. That first night in the shack turned into days, then weeks. She was a breath of fresh air, soft-spoken, quick with a smile, and pretty enough to make a man forget his troubles. He'd swing by with food and firewood, claiming business to Clara, who never suspected a thing. Before long, Jimmy was smitten, hooked deeper than he'd ever been with Clara. He tracked down Amos the fortune teller the next day, tossing him a fat pouch of coins. "You're a wizard, old man," he grinned. Amos just winked and pocketed the cash. After a while, Jimmy couldn't stand the sneaking around. He wanted Abby with him, proper-like, as his wife. One night, over a flickering candle, he spilled it all to her. "Abby, I'm married, but it ain't working. I want you instead. What do you say?" She blushed, then nodded shyly. "If you'll have me, Jimmy, I'd be glad." That settled it, but Clara was the hitch. How'd he ditch her without breaking his promise to Walter? He took it to Martha, figuring her sharp mind could untangle the mess. They sat in the kitchen, whispering over cold coffee. "Ma, I've met someone, Abigail. She's the one I want. But Clara..." Martha's eyes lit up like a firecracker. "Well, hallelujah. A gal who might give me grandkids? Bring her in, boy." Yeah, but folks'll talk, Jimmy said, frowning. We owe everything to Walter. Kicking Clara out looks ungrateful, downright rotten. Martha tapped her chin, then smirked. We'll make her the bad guy. Give it 10 days. My 50th birthday's coming. We'll use that. The plan was simple but nasty. On Martha's birthday, Jimmy threw a big shindig at the Grayson estate, invited neighbors, traders, the whole town. He gave Martha a fancy shawl as a gift, playing the dutiful son. Mid-party, while folks laughed and clinked mugs, a wail erupted from the back room. Everyone rushed in, finding Martha on her knees, sobbing and bowing to Clara, who stood there stunned. What in tarnation? Jimmy yelled, dropping to his ma's side. Ma, what's she done? Martha wailed louder, clutching at Clara's skirt. Please, Clara, let us be. You've made our lives misery long enough. Clara, flustered, stammered, I don't, but Jimmy cut in, glaring. You've gone too far this time. Humiliating my ma like this? We're done here. He hauled Martha up and stormed out, leaving the crowd buzzing. Word spread fast. Martha told a tale, how Claire had been a tyrant since they moved in, picking fights, lording her family's name over them. That day, she'd supposedly snapped at Martha, forcing her to grovel just to stay. It was a lie pure and simple, but Clara, quiet and awkward, couldn't defend herself. Under the townsfolk's glares, she fainted, overwhelmed. Jimmy fanned the flames, packing bags like he and Martha were leaving. The neighbors begged them to stay, turning on Clara instead. Crushed and cornered, she gathered her things and slipped out of the estate, disappearing into the night. 2 weeks later, Jimmy brought Abby home, bold as brass. The town whispered, but he didn't care. Clara was gone, and he had what he wanted. 8 months later, Abby gave birth to a chubby boy. The timing raised eyebrows. 8 months ain't 9, but Jimmy and Martha were too thrilled to notice. They doted on little Tommy, basking in their new life. Then disaster struck. The very night Tommy was born, bandits hit the Grayson estate. A gang of roughnecks, likely tipped off by Doc rumors of Jimmy's wealth, stormed in with torches and guns. They cleaned out the gold, the silver, everything. In the chaos, Martha got trapped in the burning kitchen. Flames swallowed her up. Abby and Tommy vanished, snatched or lost in the smoke. Jimmy couldn't tell. By morning, he stood in the ashes, broke and alone. The estate was a ruin, his family gone. From riches to rags in a single night, Jimmy turned beggar, drifting Williamsburg streets, a shadow of the man he'd been. 3 years dragged by since the bandits torched Jimmy's world. He'd gone from lord of the Grayson estate to a ragged beggar, haunting Williamsburg's alleys with a limp and a hollow stare. Folks who once tipped their hats now crossed the street to avoid him. One chilly afternoon, scrounging for scraps near the market, he spotted a familiar face, Amos, the fortune-teller, still perched at his stall like nothing had changed. Jimmy hobbled over, bitterness bubbling up. You, he growled, pointing a shaky finger. You set me on this path. Amos looked him over, unfazed. Sit down, Henderson. You look like death warmed over. Jimmy slumped onto the stool, too tired to argue. Amos leaned in, voice low. You're wondering how it all went wrong, ain't you? Well, here's the kicker, me and Abby. We were in cahoots from the start. That night on Main Street, her tears the rope, it was a play, scripted to hook you. She was already carrying some other fella's kid when you found her. We figured you for an easy mark, rich, restless, ripe to fall for a pretty face. Worked like a charm, too, till those bandits mucked it up. Jimmy's gut twisted, rage and regret choking him. You conniving snake, he rasped.
I lost the waiting. Ma, the house, my boy, course of your lease. Amos shrugged.
You lost it, 'cause you threw away what you had. Clara was gold, and you traded her for fool's gold. That's on you, son.
The truth hit like a musket ball.
Jimmy stumbled off, Amos's words ringing in his ears. For 20 more years he wandered, a ghost in tattered rags, begging crusts and sleeping in barns. Clara's plain, kind face haunted him, a reminder of the life he'd trashed for greed. One freezing night, holed up in an abandoned mill outside town, hunger and cold finally broke him. He collapsed, shivering, and drifted into a fevered sleep. In his dream, Walter Grayson loomed over him, eyes blazing. You swore to protect her, you cur, he thundered, shaking a fist. Jimmy jolted awake, gasping, then went still, his last breath slipping out in the dark. Come morning, a trio passed the mill, 2 strapping young men, maybe 20, and an old woman with silver hair. They stopped to rest, spotting Jimmy's body sprawled in the dust.
The woman frotze, Perenkloser, ten leed out Aquizop.
Lord have mercy, she whispered, brushing away tears. She turned to the boys. Bury him proper, sons. Find a spot up the hill. They nodded, hauling the corpse off without a word. That woman? Clara Grayson, older, weathered, but alive. Turns out, when Jimmy drove her out, she'd been pregnant and hadn't known it. She'd fled to a cousin in Richmond, where she birthed twin boys. A kind widower, Tom Reynolds, took her in, married her, and raised the kids as his own. They grew up strong, each marrying and fathering 3 sons, 6 grandkids total, just like Amos predicted. Clara never told them about Jimmy, letting them live free of his shadow. Her new family thrived, a tight-knit clan full of love and laughter. As her sons laid Jimmy to rest, Clara lingered, staring at the unmarked grave. She'd lost everything once too, but built it back better. Jimmy? He'd had it all and pissed it away. Amos wasn't wrong, he'd been destined for sons and grandkids, but not with Abby. His greed dug his own grave. And that, folks, wraps up our first tale. I'm Nancy Thompson, and I hope you liked this wild ride through colonial Virginia.
Stick around. Next up, Ivy got another yarn for you. A frontier gal, a loyal hound, and a twisty pass to justice. You won't wanna miss it.
Leave a comment, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.
Allricht, folks, welcome back to Nancy Thompson's American Tales. Our first story's done, and now we're diving into another game straight from the wild heart of America. Picture this, it's the early 1800s, out on the edge of the Tennessee frontier, 10 miles east of a dusty little settlement called Harper's Bend.
There's a nameless hill out there, all pine and rock, where a lone cabin sits perched on the slope.
Inside, just one soul, Annie Harper, and her big ol' black hound, Shadow.
One girl, one dog, and a heap of strange tales swirling around them.
Let's get into it.
Word around Harper's Bend is that Annie and Shadow are a pair marked by fate, 2 survivors with a story sadder than a widow's hymn. Go back 20 years, when Annie was born. Her pa, a hardscrabble farmer named Jed Harper, had his heart set on a son to help work the land. When the midwife handed him a squalling girl instead, he flew into a rage. Ain't no use for her, he snarled, and ordered her dumped by the roadside like trash. Lucky for Annie, fate had other plans. An old trapper, Elias Buck Grayson, yep, a distant kin to our last tale's Walter, found her bundled in the brush while heading up the hill to hunt. He scooped her up, asked around the nearby hollows, but no one claimed her. Couldn't bear to let her starve, so Buck took her home, figuring he'd raise her himself. That choice cost him though. Buck'd been sweet on a gal from town, but when she heard he'd taken in a baby, she balked. I ain't playing ma to some stranger's brat, she said, and called off their courtship. So Buck, a grizzled bachelor with a soft spot, raised Annie alone. He was a carpenter by trade, hammering out chairs and tables for a living, and when Annie got old enough, he taught her the craft. She took to it like a duck to water, and by the time Buck passed, she was good enough to strike out on her own. She built that cabin on the hill, living off what she could make and trade, just her and the land. Then, 10 years back, disaster hit. A summer storm rolled in, rain pounding like cannon fire. Buck, out fixing a fence, felt a bad itch in his bones and hustled home. He'd barely stepped inside when the hillside gave way, a mudslide crashing down like God's own judgment. Buck shoved Annie clear, but the muck swallowed him whole. She dug for hours, screaming his name, till she found him, too late. Annie buried him up the hill, and from then on, it was just her. Well, her and Shadow, a stray pup she'd taken in not long after. That big black dog grew up fierce and loyal, standing near as tall as her waist, always by her side. Fast forward to now, Annie's 20, a lean, weathered gal with calloused hands and a quiet strength. It's a clear morning, and she's kneeling by Buck's grave, Shadow sprawled nearby. Pa, it's me again, she says, brushing dirt off the wooden cross she'd carved. Heading to Harper's Bend today to trade some pieces. I'll stop by on my way back. It's her ritual. Every trip to town, she talks to Buck first. She stands, dusting her trousers, and grins at the dog.
Shadow, You holze fort, all recht? I'll bring you a bone if he's enough.
Shadow yawns, flops his head down, and watches her go, tail thumping once. Annie slings a basket over her shoulder, packed with her handiwork, little wooden critters she's whittled herself, rabbits, butterflies, even a tiny bear, all so lifelike you'd swear they'd scamper off. Buck taught her the basics when she was knee-high, but she's honed it over the years, better than he ever was. There's a catch though, carpentry's a man's trade out here, and the old-timers don't take kindly to a gal meddling in it. Buck always said, "Keep it quiet, Annie."
Fuchs ll reiser Fuß.
So she does, passing her work off as his to dodge trouble. That's the setup, folks.
Annie Harper and Shadow, out on the frontier, living a life carved from grit and loss.
Stick with me, this tale's about to twist into something wild. A stranger's coming, and he's got questions Annie ain't ready to answer. Stay tuned. Annie hitched up her basket and trudged down the hill toward Harper's Bend, the morning sun climbing over the pines. The 10-mile hike wasn't new to her. She'd been making it since she was a kid, trailing Buck to trade his wares. Now it was her turn. The basket bumped against her hip, stuffed with those wooden critters she'd spent nights carving by lamplight. She'd gotten so good, folks swore they could hear her little rabbits thump their feet. Buck taught her the tricks, how to coax life from a block of wood, but she'd outstripped him, even if she'd never say it out loud. Men's work, he'd warned her, don't let him know it's you. So she stuck to the story, these were Buck's pieces, and she was just the go-between. By noon, she reached the edge of Harper's Bend, a scrappy little town with a muddy main street, a saloon, and a handful of shops. She set up at the far end near the blacksmith's, spreading a cloth on the ground and laying out her carvings, a rabbit with twitching ears, a butterfly mid-flutter, a bear cub on its haunches. They caught eyes quick. Townsfolk slowed down, gawking at the detail. A burly fella in a coonskin cap stopped, picking up the bear. "You make these?" he asked, squinting at her.
Nope, Annie leads motes butter.
My pa did, Buck Grayson. His legs ain't what they used to be, so I'm here trading for him. The man nodded, set the bear down, and ambled off. She kept the patter going all day, sold most of the lot by late afternoon, pocketing enough coins to buy salt, a sack of flour, and a hog bone for Shadow. She was packing up when she noticed two rough-looking types lingering nearby, eyeing her like buzzards on a carcass. Didn't think much of it yet. Heading out of town, she took the winding trail back toward the hill. About a mile in, a figure stepped out from the trees, a young man, maybe 25, lean and sharp-eyed, with a hat tipped low. It was the same fella who'd studied her bear earlier. "Been waiting for you, miss," he said, voice smooth but firm.
Names Caleb Stokes. Mind if he ask yours?
Annie, she replied, wary. "What's this about, Mr. Stokes?"
Call me Caleb.
"Your carvings, heard tell they're Buck Grayson's work. He kin to you."
Annie tends it.
Buck drilled it into her. "Don't spill the truth." "He's my pa," she said, keeping it short.
Don't know no otter Graysons.
"If you'll excuse me, I gotta get home." Caleb tipped his hat.
Fair enough.
"Didn't mean to hold you up." She brushed past, feeling his eyes on her back, and kept walking. The trail stretched long that day, the crooked oak by her hill a welcome sight in the distance. But trouble wasn't done with her. Just as the oak came into view, two shadows peeled out from the brush, the same roughnecks from town. One was lanky, with a scar across his cheek, the other stocky, hefting a rusty knife. "Well, well," Scarface sneered. "Made a pretty penny today, didn't ya? We tailed you all the way from the Bend. Hand over the cash, girlie, or we won't play nice."
Ennis quaret her Schulders.
"Best turn tail now, fellas. You won't like how this ends."
Stocki Laukhet, Twirlingse Kniefe. Think wir scaret of a little thing like you.
Back at the cabin, Shadow's ears pricked up. He'd been dozing by the door, but something, maybe Annie's scent on the wind, snapped him awake. With a low growl, he bolted down the hill, black fur a blur against the trees. The robbers didn't see him coming till it was too late. Shadow launched, all teeth and muscle, slamming Scarface to the dirt. Stocky swung his knife, but the hound was too fast, snapped at his arm, sending the blade flying. In seconds, both men were sprawled, yelling and scrambling to their feet.
"Get off, you mutt."
Stocky hollered, but Shadow's snarl said otherwise.
Enough, Shadow.
Annie called, stepping in. The dog backed off, tail stiff, eyes locked on the pair as they staggered up and ran, cursing all the way.
Annie smirked, patting Shadow's head.
Good boy. That bone's yours tonight. She pulled the hog bone from her basket, but Shadow didn't take it right away. He turned, staring into the darkening woods, ears twitching like he heard something she didn't. What's got you, huh? She muttered, glancing over her shoulder.
Nothing but shadows. Come on, let's get home.
Shadow followed, crunching the bone in one bite as they climbed back to the cabin. That night, Annie sat by the fire, whittling a new piece, a hawk this time, her face set hard. Shadow's growls woke her once, but when she checked, the hill was quiet. Come morning, though, she'd have a visitor, and he'd bring more questions than she wanted to answer. Annie settled in for the night, the fire crackling low as she whittled that hawk, her knife shaving curls of wood onto the cabin floor. Shadow sprawled by the door, gnawing his bone, but around midnight, he bolted up, a deep growl rumbling in his chest.
Annie set the hawk down, grabbing here paar old flintlock from the wall.
What is it, boy? She whispered, creeping to the window. The hill was still, nothing but the wind rattling the pines. Shadow paced, then flopped back down, but his ears stayed perked. Annie shrugged it off, figuring it was a coon or a fox, and crawled back into her cot. Sleep came uneasy, though, with Shadow's restlessness lingering in her mind. Come morning, she was up with the sun, frying a scrap of bacon when a knock rattled the door. Shadow barked, teeth bared, till Annie hushed him. She swung it open, and there stood Caleb Stokes, hat in hand, looking sheepish. Morning, Miss Annie, he said, eyeing the snarling hound. Mind calling off your guard, dog? Shadow quit it, she snapped, and the dog slunk off to a corner, still glaring.
What are you doing here, Caleb? Ain't no social calls this far out.
He grinned, easy as you please. Heard tell of a hill with rare timber, red oak maybe. Thought I'd scout it out. Didn't expect to find you here, though.
Small world. Annie crossed her arms, skeptical. Ain't no retroak vers Adam up here. Just pine ence da. Jure barking up the wrong tree.
Caleb chuckled, stepping inside when she didn't shoo him off. His eyes roamed the cabin, landing on the half-finished hawk on the table. You're handy with a knife, he said, picking it up. Folks in town say Buck Grayson's the craftsman, but I'm guessing there's more to it. Annie snatched the hawk back, her voice tight. I told you, Pa made em.
Just sell em. Don't go poking where you ain't welcome.
He held up his hands. No offense meant. Just saying, Buck's work was legend back in the day. I knew him, sorta. My uncle apprenticed with him years ago. These carvings? They've got his touch, but finer. Almost like someone took his lessons and ran with them. He studied her, waiting. Annie's gut churned. Buck warned her, carpentry was a man's game, and folks'd pitch a fit if they knew a gal was behind it. I mess around with a knife sometimes, she admitted, dodging.
Idle Hans, you know.
But Pa's the name on em. That's how it stays. Caleb nodded slow, turning the hawk over in his hands. Funny thing, Buck's mark was a little notch on every piece right here. He tapped the base.
Yours got it too. Same style, same flair.
You're his kin, all right. She stiffened. He's gone, Caleb.
Been 10 years.
Mudslide took him. Told me never to say I carved him, so I don't.
That's all you need to know.
His face softened. Sorry to hear it. Buck was a good man, too good for how he ended up. He paused, then shifted gears.
Jure wat, 20? Ain't married yet.
Annie bristled. Ain't looking, neither.
M.A. and Shadow do fine.
Fair enough, Caleb said, setting the hawk down. But I'll say it, we'd make a pair.
I wittle some myself, look.
He pulled a wooden fox from his pocket, rough but decent, close to her style. Reckon we're cut from the same cloth.
Could be a matchmade in heaven.
She eyed the fox, impressed despite herself, but shook her head. No thanks, mister. I ain't in the market for a husband.
Got a nook on my plate.
Caleb tipped his hat again.
So eat yourself.
I'll be back in a few days. Got business down the river.
Think it over. He stepped out, leaving Annie staring at the door, shadow crawling low.
She didn't know it yet, but Caleb's visit was just the spark. Next morning, she'd wake to a bigger mess, one that'd drag her and Shadow into a fight she couldn't dodge. Annie didn't sleep much that night, Caleb's words rattling around in her head like loose marbles. She was up before dawn, stoking the fire and sipping bitter coffee, when Shadow started barking, sharp and urgent, not his usual grumble. She grabbed the flintlock again, peering out the window. A dozen men stomped up the hill, torches flickering in the gray light, their voices a low rumble of anger. Shadow planted himself at the door, hackles up, growling like a bear. "Easy, boy," Annie muttered, slinging the rifle over her shoulder. She stepped outside, chin high, ready for whatever they'd brought. The leader, a barrel-chested man with a gray beard and a carpenter's apron, jabbed a finger at her. "You Annie Harper," he barked. "We know what you're up to, girl. Them carvings in town, Buck Grayson's my eye. He's been dead 10 years, and here you are, passing off your work like it's his. Women ain't supposed to meddle in our trade, it's against the guild, against nature." Another piped up, a skinny fella with a mean squint. Buck was a master, sure, but he got himself kicked out for breaking rules. Didn't think he'd stoop to teaching a gal. That's a slap to every craftsman from here to Knoxville. "Shut your trap about my pa," Annie snapped, her voice cutting through the chill. "I don't know how you found me, but you're on my land. Get off, or Shadow here'll make you." The men hesitated. Shadow's snarl was no joke, his jaws still flecked with hogbone from yesterday, but Greybeard pressed on.
"You schämte Kraft, Missy. Auch das mesh your hands for it. Keep you from whittling again."
Annie's grip tightened on the flintlock, her eyes cold as the barrel. "Try it, and you'll be burying more in your pride." Just then, a shout broke the standoff. Caleb Stokes shoved through the crowd, panting like he'd run the whole way. "Hold up, you louts," he yelled, planting himself between Annie and the mob. "Y'all got this twisted. Buck wouldn't break no rules on purpose, and Annie ain't either. Women can carve if they're kin to a craftsman, guild says so, long as she's tied to a family trade."
"Cool your heads."
Greybeard scowled. "That's a stretch, Stokes. Who's she tied to? Buck's worm food." Caleb flashed a grin, slick as a fox.
Tats who.
"Annie and I are engaged, set to wed in a month.
The Stokes families got carpenters back 3 generations.
She's one of us now. That's square enough for you." The mob blinked, thrown off. Annie's jaw clenched. She hadn't signed up for this, but Caleb's bluff was working. "Stokes clan's solid," a younger man muttered. "If she's marrying in, I reckon it's legit." Greybeard grumbled but nodded. "Your word better hold, Caleb. We'll be watching." "Count on it," Caleb said, turning to Annie with a wink.
"Showing, honey."
She forced a stiff nod, swallowing her fury as the men shuffled off, muttering. Once they were gone, Caleb faced her, hands raised. "Before you shoot me, hear me out. That was a dodge to save your hide, and Buck's name. You don't want to marry me, I won't push. But it bought you time." Annie glared, then sighed.
"Fine.
"I'll play along, for Pa. Them carvings are all I've got left of him. But don't get cozy, Stokes." He tipped his hat. "Wouldn't dream of it. Yet." The next month flew by in a blur. Annie kept carving, dodging prying eyes, while Caleb spread the engagement yarn around Harper's Bend. Shadow, though, took to roaming, out for hours, coming back muddy and restless. Wedding day rolled around, and Annie stood in a borrowed dress, feeling like a trapped coon. Caleb's folks sent a wagon decked with ribbons, but Shadow blocked the path, growling at the driver till Annie shushed him. "Move, you big lug," she said, voice catching. Caleb frowned. Dog's bad luck on a wedding day. Send him off. Annie knelt, stroking Shadow's ears. "Go home, boy. I'll be back for you, I swear." Shadow whined, trailed the wagon 10 miles, then howled at the sky, a sound that'd haunt her all night. The wedding went off without a hitch, at least on the surface. Annie rode that ribbon-decked wagon into Harper's Bend, Shadow's howls fading behind her. Caleb's folks, the Stokes clan, threw a modest shindig in their big clapboard house, fiddle music, cornbread, and enough whiskey to float a raft. Annie played her part, stiff in her borrowed dress, nodding through the preacher's words. Caleb stood beside her, all grins and charm, sealing the deal with a quick "I do." Folks clapped, toasted, and shuffled out as dusk settled, leaving the newlyweds to their night. In the bedroom, Annie sat on the quilted bed, tugging at her collar. "Caleb, I ain't myself these days," she said, dodging the inevitable. "Been run ragged. Give me some grace, all right?" He flushed, scratching his neck. "Sure, darlin'. I get it." He ducked out, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She let out a shaky breath, relief, mostly. Marriage or not, she wasn't ready for that part. Sleep didn't come easy, though. Shadow's absence gnawed at her, and the house felt foreign, all creaks and shadows. Past midnight, restless, she slipped out of bed. The Stokes place was a maze, wide halls, locked doors, and she wandered barefoot, till a flicker of light drew her to the study. Voices leaked through the crack. Caleb and his pa, Amos Stokes, hunched over a desk littered with papers. Annie pressed close, ears sharp, and what she heard turned her blood cold. "Keep it hush, son," Amos was saying, voice low. "Buck Grayson's girl's a gold mine. We tricked her into this. Those men at her cabin? Our hired hands, stirring the pot. She's too green to fight back. Get her carving day and night, slap our name on it, and we'll corner the market. Buck was sharper than me back in the day, beat me in every contest. I framed him for cheating, got him booted from the guild. Never thought he'd pass his knack to a daughter." Caleb laughed, cold as ice. "She's ours now, pa. And that damn dog of hers, big black brute. We gotta deal with it, root and stem." "Already did," Amos said, smirking. "Sent Jed and his boys up the hill yesterday. Torched the cabin, roughed up the mutt. Won't be a problem no more." Annie's knees buckled, her breath hitching. Her shadow, hurt? Dead? And her home gone? Rage boiled up, but she was outnumbered, trapped in their den. She crept back to the bedroom, mind racing. Couldn't run, not yet. She'd have to bide her time, play dumb till she could strike back. Next morning, Caleb was all smiles over breakfast. "Time to earn your keep, wife," he said, sliding a block of wood her way. "Carve something pretty, Stokes brand on it, see?" She nodded, hands trembling as she took the knife. 3 days later, she couldn't take it. "Caleb," she said, voice steady, "I need to check the hill, see what's left." He waved her off. "Go on then. Be quick." She hitched a mule and rode out alone, heart pounding. The cabin was a smoldering wreck, charred beams, ash everywhere. She called for Shadow, voice breaking, and found him in a gully near the hill's base. He was a mess, matted fur, bloodied flank, barely breathing. "Oh boy," she sobbed, dropping beside him. "You waited for me." Shadow's eyes flickered, his tail thumping weak. Then a voice, raspy, impossible, came from his jaws. "Annie, it's me." She froze. Buck." "Nah, just Shadow," he wheezed, a faint chuckle. "Stokes re your curse, girl. Beat 'em at their game. You're better 'en they'll ever be. Live, Annie, live good." His head sank, and he was gone. Tears streaming, Annie buried him next to Buck's grave, her knife carving a rough marker. "Rest with Pa, Shadow. I've got this." From the ruins, she salvaged one thing, a singed carving knife, her last tie to home. She gripped it tight, turned back to Harper's Bend, and marched into the lion's den, ready to settle the score. Annie rode back to Harper's Bend, the singed carving knife tucked in her belt, Shadow's last words burning in her chest. She wasn't the same gal who'd left that morning. Grief and fury had forged something harder. Back at the Stokes house, Caleb was lounging in the front room, sipping coffee like a king. "Find anything worth saving?" he asked, smirking. "Enough," Annie said, her face a mask. She sat across from him, hands steady. "Reckon I'll keep carving for you. What's next?" He grinned, oblivious. "Good girl. There's a big contest up in Knoxville, carvers from all over. I want you in it, but under our name. Stokes'll be the talk of the territory." She nodded, playing along. "When?" 5 days. Get to work." That night, while the house slept, Annie made her move. She slipped out the back, climbed down from a window with a rope of knotted sheets, and swapped her dress for a pair of Caleb's trousers and a shirt, men's clothes to dodge notice. She hitched the mule and rode hard for Knoxville, 5 days of dust and grit, her knife her only companion. When she got there, the town square was buzzing, carvers, traders, and gawkers crowding around for the annual woodcraft fair. Tents lined the streets, and the air smelled of sawdust and whiskey. Annie signed up under her own name, not Stokes, not Grayson, just Annie Harper. The contest rules were simple: carve a bear in 3 hours, best one wins. She set up at a bench, ignoring the stares. Folks weren't used to a woman in the mix. Caleb's pa, Amos, was there, a judge in a fancy vest, strutting like he owned the place. Annie kept her head down, letting her knife dance. She didn't use Buck's tricks this time, those were hers to keep. Instead, she carved from memory, Shadow's hulking shape, fierce and alive, every bristle sharp enough to sting. The hours flew, and when the bell rang, she set her bear on the table, last in line for judging. The crowd oohed and awed over the others, especially a lean kid in black, Luke Tanner, whose bear snarled with a quiet menace. Then came Annie's turn. She peeled back the cloth, and a hush fell. Her bear wasn't just wood, it was Shadow reborn, lunging off the block like it'd tear into you. The judges, Amos included, gaped, sweat beading on their brows. Luke sauntered over, stone-faced. "That's something else," he muttered. "You're Annie, huh?"
I'm Luke.
"Won't forget you." She smirked. "Good. I ain't here to be forgot." Before the winners were called, Annie stepped up, voice ringing out. "Hold on, folks. I've got a word." Amos tried to cut in, "She's my son's wife." But she waved him off. "Name's Annie Harper. My pa was Buck Grayson, a carver you might know. The Stokes clan, Amos and Caleb, they burned my home, killed my dog, and tricked me into their house to steal my work. Years back, Amos framed Buck, got him kicked from the guild over a rigged contest. They've been cheating ever since. I'm here to set it right, for Pa and me." The crowd erupted, whispers turning to shouts. An old man in a blue coat, Judge Elias Boone, a legend in these parts, limped forward, his face stern but kind. "Stand up, girl," he said, raising a hand for quiet. "We'll get to the bottom of this. If the Stokes done wrong, they'll pay." Amos and Caleb blanched, sweat pouring now. Boone's word was law. When he stomped, the frontier shook. Annie didn't go back to the Stokes place. Over the next few days, Boone dug into the mess. Turned out Amos had a trail of dirty deals, bribes, threats, even that contest that sank Buck. The truth came spilling out. He'd lured Buck into a rigged bet, smeared him as a cheat, and got him banished. The Stokes empire crumbled, house sold, name mud. Boone called Annie in.
Vad du vantone vis las. Take it all, Chesaid.
Wasn't theirs to start with. And I need a minute with Luke Tanner, he's owed to talk. She found Luke whittling by the river, his bear still clutched from the contest. He'd taken first, her second.
You beat em fair, Chesaid. Booked like you.
He grinned, rare for him.
Join em ten.
Boone's offering me a shop, could use a partner. Annie hesitated, then nodded. Deal. But I've got a dog to fetch first. Annie walked away from Knoxville with her head high, the sting of the Stokes' downfall still fresh. Judge Elias Boone had stripped them bare, house auctioned off, Amos and Caleb reduced to begging on the streets they once strutted. Boone pulled Annie aside before she left. "Girl, you've got grit," he said, his blue coat flapping in the wind. "Ever thought of apprenticing with me?"
Ikave Amin Igle.
She smiled, respectful but firm.
"Kent, sir. Got my on pass.
But here's a thank you." She handed him a small box. He opened it later, a wooden hawk, so real it seemed ready to soar. Boone took a deep breath, muttering, "Buck, you raised a wonder."
I'm giallos es hell. Annie hitze rot, winding back toward Harper's Bend.
Along the way, she passed a peddler's cart, a wiry old man teasing a scrawny black pup, half-starved and shivering. The sight stopped her cold, too much like Shadow's start. She traded her last coin for the little mutt, scooping it up. "You're mine now, Blackie," she said, tucking it under her arm. Back on her hill she rebuilt, a small shack where the cabin once stood, just enough for her and Blackie. She nursed him strong, his yips turning to barks, a shadow of her old friend. 3 years later, a figure rode up, Luke Tanner, clad in black, his face still sharp as a blade. He'd been tracking her since Knoxville, running that shop Boone gave him. Heard you're still carving, he said, dismounting.
Bitte me once, Ivant aremech.
Annie laughed, Blackie bounding at her heels. Took you 5 years to try again? Worth it, he grinned. Won this time, barely.
So war's your wish.
She eyed him, then Blackie. Marry me. But Blackie's in the wedding.
Done, Luke Said, no hesitation.
He's family now. They built a life, simple, sturdy, next to her shack. Luke wasn't much for words, but his hands spoke through wood, matching her cut for cut. They wed under an oak, Blackie prancing between them, a preacher muttering vows quick so they could get to the good part. Annie insisted on it, no fancy fuss, just sky and earth as witnesses. From then on, wherever they went, selling carvings, bartering in town, Blackie tagged along, grinning like he owned the place. And that's the end, folks. Annie Harper turned loss into strength, outsmarted the snakes, and found her place with Luke and Blackie. A frontier gal who carved her own way, literally. Hope you loved this one as much as the last. I'm Nancy Thompson, and if you're hooked, drop a line below, subscribe, share, whatever tickles you. Next time, I've got more tales to spin. Thanks for riding along. See you soon.